Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be doing the Cemetery Boys book tag. This tag was, of course, created by Audrey over at Perpetual Pages, so if you have not seen their original tag, go and watch it. And if you don't know what Cemetery Boys is, this is a story about Yadriel, who is a trans brujo trying to prove to his family that he can go through his rites of passage and have all of the same abilities as the other men in his family. But things get interesting when he accidentally summons the spirit of one of his recently deceased classmates. There's adventure, there is chaos, also known as Julian Diaz himself. This is such a good book. I actually finished the last 130 pages of this all in one sitting last night, so I didn't go to bed until like 2 a.m. and I had to stop myself from immediately rereading it. So it's a great book. If you have somehow missed out on the hype around this book, I will also link a couple of Audrey's other videos. There's a fairly decent sized hype train for Cemetery Boys, but they single-handedly laid down the tracks and are now conducting it. So check out their channel to learn more about these beautiful, dumbass gay boys. So on to the tag. The first prompt is Yadriel, an underhyped book that exceeded your expectations. And for that, I'm going to say The Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls by Anissa Gray. This is a book that I had seen the cover for, and I really liked the cover. The synopsis wasn't super appealing to me. It's like, going in, I knew that one of the characters was in jail, and that it was like a family drama. But the plot was a bit more than that. It's about a family. It goes back and forth between the perspectives of these different sisters within this family. One of them is in jail for embezzling money, and then the other ones are kind of having to pick up the pieces. One of them is taking care of the family house. Another one of them is, her relationship is kind of falling apart, and she's also struggling with an eating disorder. So there's kind of a lot going on, but I didn't really know if I was going to like it just because it is very just like family drama, but it was done really, really well. I ended up borrowing it on a whim from the library. This was back in February, so I was doing a lot of driving and listening to audiobooks while I drove. And this one just happened to be available, and I had recognized the cover. All of the voices were very unique, so I think going back and forth between characters was very effective. The way that you actually did see very different things from their perspective, I thought added to the story as well. And the plot was interesting. It also hit on a lot of big issues that I wasn't expecting. Like, I didn't know, I think, about the eating disorder bit going in, and there was a lot more about mental health as well. And there's also a big look into family trauma and how that is passed down from person to person in different ways, and how that gets kind of complicated. So I was really impressed with that book, especially after not really going in knowing much of what to expect. Prompt number 2 is Julian, a book that doesn't stick to one genre. And for that, I have 2 books that both kind of blur the lines between fiction and nonfiction in different ways. First, I have Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Fienberg. And this is a fiction book, but it's based on her actual personal experience being in lesbian bars in the 50s and 60s. And this was a really excellent book. I read this towards the beginning of the year before I was doing BookTube and Bookstagram and stuff like that. It was such an impactful book. I definitely recommend it especially if you're interested in LGBT history, because while it's not a history book, it is informed by someone who is living that. It is very intense though. It talks really bluntly about sexual assaults, police brutality, suicide, lots of heavy topics. But it was a really excellent book. Another book that I have that kind of blurs fiction and memoir is going to be Freshwater by Akwaeke and Emezi, and this actually has additional kind of fantastical elements. The whole premise of this book is that the main character was born with gods inside of them. So the book jumps into different perspectives between kind of the person's main self, and then it also goes into some of the gods, and then even some of the other personalities that they have. Both of these books I read this year, and both of these books got 5 stars. The next prompt is Maritza, a book that helped you through a tough time. And this was kind of a hard question, because I feel like when things are at their worst, I tend to have kind of a complicated relationship with certain stuff going on. Lately, there's been a number of hard things going on, and I think that a lot of the books that I've read in the past year have really helped me. I do have a tendency to very heavily turn into escapism, but looking not just within the past year, but further back, a lot of the stuff that I leaned on like that wasn't strictly books. There was a period of time where it was absolutely fan fiction, in certain TV shows, Doctor Who and Sherlock. So far as fan fiction goes, it was Wolfstar, which that is Harry Potter related, and I absolutely do not condone anything that J.K. Rowling does, and I feel like I've made that pretty clear across my platforms. But, you know, I can't talk about it like it wasn't a part of my life, because I was hugely into Harry Potter. Like, it was a significant portion of my personality. In middle school, that was like what I attached myself to, those books, and then as an adult, it was the fan fiction. And then another series that I ended up turning to that I would also not recommend is the House of Night series. This was one that I was really into in high school. It's a vampire series. I, as an adult, do not think that I could stomach my way through it, just on the narration style alone. There were especially a couple of years where I was just really, really depressed, but of course I didn't have the language for any of that. So I ended up just turning to books and just constantly reading. And this was one of the book series that gave me some serotonin. Now, the rest of the books that I'll talk about in this tag are actually books that I would recommend. Prompt number 4 is Quinces, your favorite coming-of-age story. Now, I've read a lot of coming-of-age books recently, and I have 2 for this prompt. One is a more traditional coming-of-age story that focuses on an adolescent, and then the other one is more of an adult coming-of-age story. So, the more traditional coming-of-age story that I have is Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender. This goes through and looks at Felix's experience after he is outed at his school. A bunch of pictures from him before his transition get posted everywhere along with his dead name, and he goes on to try to figure out who did it to get revenge. There are a few things that make this story a really good coming-of-age story, and one of them is the fact that, you know, Felix really fucks up, and he has to contend with that in, you know, ways that I think is pretty realistic. Kind of going off of that, the love triangle that is in it falls into that theme to a certain degree, on top of themes of, like, you accept the love you think you deserve, so you have to be, like, open to that sort of thing. And on top of all of this, this is a coming-of-age story of a trans person, which we, at least in the past, have not gotten to see a whole lot of, especially not Own Voices stuff about the trans experience. And this one is particularly unique because this is the perspective of someone who transitioned, kind of thought he was a trans boy, and ended up being slightly on the non-binary spectrum. So that makes it kind of additionally interesting and really important representation, especially as, like, a YA novel that is a coming-of-age story. Now, the less conventional answer that I have for this question is The Seep by Chana Porter. So in this, we have our main character, Trina, and she is very old in this book. I don't know if it says specifically how old, but in this setting, aliens have come to Earth and given them this technology called the Seep. And so Trina isn't necessarily contending with herself growing older, but she is contending with times changing, and specifically how that has impacted her own personal life, and the fact that her wife has decided to make a severe change. So she is not only getting used to kind of this new world in a certain way, but it's really about moving on to this different part of life, you know, and I think that's kind of how it fits into the coming of age, because with adolescence, you're having to deal with all of these different responsibilities. The dynamics between the people that are changing. And this is also what Trina is having to deal with. And I think something that both of these books have in common is that neither of their main characters are presented as somebody who's perfect. They both make pretty big mistakes, or have certain aspects of them that are kind of unlikable. And those traits and those decisions end up impacting the story. Prompt number 5 is Dia de Muertos, a backlist book that you wish you could bring back and hype again. There are a few books that came to mind with this prompt, but the one that I chose was the Saga series, which I recently put up a vlog for, and I really, really enjoyed this. And looking at all the Goodreads reviews, it looked like people were really hyped for it because it's a really great series. It was almost across the board 5 stars for me. There were a couple that I think I gave like 4.5 or 4 stars for because the pacing was weird. And then another one that just had some slurs that I did not think were necessary. They got a slightly lower rating as well. But if you have not read the series yet, it is a fantasy comic series that focuses on this couple who are each a part of different alien races that are at war with each other. They end up falling in love while one of them is imprisoned and the other is the guard, and they end up escaping and having a child. And this is all told from the child's perspective in the future. And I will say this series does hit on a lot of really tough topics. There's a lot of violence, a lot of themes about war, and a lot of sexual stuff. Assault is brought up, so is miscarriage. So go into it knowing that there's going to be a lot of tough stuff, but it is really, like, across the board, from characters to plot, just a really solid series. Prompt number 6 is Pan de Muerto, a story you wish you could offer your loved ones. This question was a little bit hard, mostly because the very first book that I thought of to answer the prompt with, Audrey used. So, I will talk a little bit about that book and then another book that answers the prompt as well. Sorted by Jackson Bird is the first thing that came to mind, because not only is it a really engaging and interesting memoir that looks at the trans experience, there were specific pieces of Jackson's story that I could definitely relate to, but it's also a really great educational tool. There are lots of asides that he includes to kind of explain some stuff. Like, he'll have, like, the regular story and then the asides. And they might explain stuff like, what does assigned female at birth mean? Or he even has, like, documentary recommendations. So it's a really, really useful resource. But another book that I would say also answers this question is Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Vaid-Menon. In this, Alok spends the first half or so of the book talking about their own experience being non-binary and people's reactions to them being non-binary. They say a bunch of really wonderful stuff. Some of it was pretty relatable. And then at the end of the book, they spend debunking trans-related myths. So, again, we have engaging story, also good educational tool, although this is kind of much shorter, but it's still really impactful. Next, we have number 7, which is Tether, a book you feel most connected to. And of course, I have 3 books that I want to talk about for this because I am indecisive as hell. I'll start with my kind of older answer. It's a book that I have not read in a number of years, but I was really, really connected to parts of the main character, and that is Perks of Being a Wallflower, which is kind of classic YA. Some people think cheesy or pretentious YA, but I really loved it, and I really, really connected with Charlie's character on the basis of, like, social anxiety, but also just generally being overwhelmed at, like, how the world is. I don't know. There's a lot to unpack from there, but I've read this a few times, and I also watched the movie, which I did really enjoy. Of course, the book is always better, but I was not mad about the movie. The next book that I have is a pretty stereotypical queer answer, and that is I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver. I read this at the end of last year or at the beginning of this year. Can't remember off the top of my head. but this was the first time that I read an own voices book with a non-binary main character. And I think this was the second book that I had read with a non-binary main character in general. And there was a lot of this that I really related to. Some of the self-talk that Ben engages in is stuff that I'm super familiar with. And the description of dysphoria is the first time that I really saw somebody describe that in such a perfect way to me. So there you have that. And then the last book is one that I actually read this month. And I don't think that I've been so thoroughly seen in this particular way. Some of it having to do with like personality aspects, and some of it having to do with the relationship dynamic that happens. That is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. And this might not surprise you if you've seen the vlog where I talk about this. I had to cut out so much crying when I was talking about this, just because of how fucking relatable it was in so many different ways. Prompt number 8 is Portaje, a book that was passed on to you. I forgot to grab this book when I was up earlier, and there is a cat on my lap now, and she does not want to get up, so I'll just talk about them. But I have 2 Rod McKuen poetry books that I was going to pull up. Both of these I found at used bookstores, different bookstores at different points in my life, but I found them both with kind of the same person. I talk about this a little bit more in depth in one of the tags that I've done recently that I can link, but that is the one that I wanted to mention because it was a used book, so that kind of fits the prompt, but also there's a connection to a person there as well. Then prompt number 9, we have Wet Binder. Name a book that you're stuck on. Since I've already talked about Alok once in this video, I now have to talk about Andrea Gibson, who is a queer poet. I absolutely adore all of their stuff. I think Pansy is probably the favorite book out of the ones that I've read, but they're all really, really wonderful. They talk about being non-binary, being queer, being chronically ill. They also talk about other social issues as well. There's just a whole lot of really great stuff, and their words are just magical. They actually recently put out a new poem with a video that's very, very touching that is talking about the planet. So I'll link that because you should definitely check it out. And just read their poetry in general. When I did have Scribd, I think a number of their books were on there, so you can check them out that way, or just look around online because there are a lot of different performances that they have up just on YouTube in general. And the final prompt is Picasso, a soft book that you really love. And again, I've got 2 answers because that's who I am as a person. First, we have Mooncakes, which is just adorable. I actually reread this recently. The story is about a witch and a non-binary werewolf who were childhood friends that reconnect in order to fight a demon. This is the most soft, autumnal story. It's so queer, and just the artwork itself is really magical. I don't know, I really adore it. There's also some representation for older queer people as well, because the main character's grandmas are a couple. Then the other book that I have for the Picasso prompt is another magical graphic novel. That is The Witch Boy. This is actually the first in a trilogy, and I would definitely recommend the whole thing. This is a middle grade fantasy that centers around Aster. And in Aster's family, all of the boys are shapeshifters and all of the girls are witches. But Aster has not really been able to shapeshift, but has taken a really huge interest in witch magic. So this is him trying to navigate that. It's definitely a trans allegory on top of a really interesting plot by itself. But the way that the plot fits in with the trans allegory just gives me a lot of feelings. And on top of it being kind of queer in that way, there's also some actual queer representation. Aster's best friend has 2 dads, and then there's also some sapphic crushing going on in the last book of the trilogy. So that is the Cemetery Boys book tag. If you have read Cemetery Boys or any of the other books that I mentioned, let me know any of your thoughts about them down in the comments. And if you haven't read Cemetery Boys yet, please go read it. It's definitely worth the hype. It made me feel so many things. I think I've seen multiple people talk about the fact that it seems really obvious that Aiden Thomas used to write fan fiction. And I have to say that I completely agree. And I think the details that come from that really makes all of the feelings happen kind of in that particular way that made me love the book so much. On top of lots of other little details that are just have nothing to do with fan fiction conventions and everything to do with the fact that Aiden Thomas is also a great writer just in general. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. Bye.